program. There has been a last-minute change in speakers, as you can see from the screen here. Mr. Don Ringwald of the Hudson River Day Line Company will be presenting instead of Craig Marshall. So let me bring him out here and we can welcome him. Hey Don, right up. Mr. Don Ringwald.
Greetings. On behalf of the Hudson River Day Line, I'm really pleased to welcome you all aboard our dayliner today, the Robert Fulton, on this beautiful day in 1949. Our day line, and this is a story today about the day line. This is the Robert Fulton, the boat we're all on right now, and we are on the lounge, in the lounge on the second deck, right about here someplace. And this is where we are right now in 1949. My name is Don Ringwald, and I was asked by Mr. Marshall to give this presentation today on his behalf. You see, for several years I was the bursar for working for the Hudson River Day Line Company, and I had a great interest, very high interest in the history of the day line and steamboats in general. My interest was so great that I authored this book, The History of the Hudson River Day Line, in 1965. And that went over so well that I was asked to do another book. So I authored this book on the Mary Powell, probably the most famous steamboat on the Hudson River. And we'll talk more about that wonderful boat very soon. So Mr. Marshall thought that with this knowledge and interest that I have of steamboats, I might be able to give a more informative presentation than the one that he had proposed to make. So I was really pleased actually to be invited by Mr. Marshall to give this presentation, but I had a little concern. You see, I died in 1987. I thought that would be a problem, but Mr. Marshall said, no, that's not a problem, because on today's cruise, as we go up the Hudson River to Poughkeepsie, we are turning the clock back to 1949. Well, that's a good thing, because in 1949, I was alive, so here I am. So let's get underway with our tour of the history of the steamboats. It really begins in 1807, when Robert Fulton launched his famous boat, the Clermont. He did not invent steamboats. This was not the first steamboat, but it was the first successful commercial operation with scheduled stops along the river. He was able to achieve a monopoly for several years because his financial backer, Robert Livingston, was a very powerful political figure. But that monopoly ended in 1924, which happened to be the same year that the Erie Canal opened. Now, the Erie Canal was very good for the steamboat business because at last there was a complete inland waterway from New York City out to the Great Lakes. So what some companies did, most of them did, you can see this 1918 brochure from the Day Line. They would advertise to the folks that they could be the first leg on a trip to distant points such as Saratoga, Niagara Falls, and other points beyond Albany. And that really helped increase the steamboat business. Going back to our timeline, 1851 was the first railroad from New York City to Albany. Now you might think that this could provide serious competition for the steamboat business, but in fact, just the opposite happened. You see, in the early days of railroads, and actually for several years, the railroads were very noisy, they were dirty, and very, very uncomfortable. If you wanted speed, you take the train, but a lot of people really wanted to go up the Hudson and get to the destination in comfort. In fact, we might even say luxury, as you'll see shortly. So very short after the railroad opened up, we began the golden age of steamboating on the Hudson. There were two types of boats. The night boats ran nights, of course, and they were there for people who primarily wanted to get from New York City to Albany and points beyond. So they were after speed. They didn't care about looking at the beautiful scenery during the day. They had their steamer trunks, which were unloaded at Albany, put on stages and other transportation to go to their final destination. The day boats ran day, And in the case of the Hudson River Day Line, were the most famous, they only ran passengers. There was no freight, whereas the night boats did a lot of freight business as well. A good example of one of the, what we'll call palatial steamboats was our company's Albany, which was built in 1880. Incidentally, you notice the L 1892. Not a lot of people know about this, but when the steamboat company needed more room on a steamboat, rather than build another boat, they lengthened the existing boat almost 30 feet. And the way they did this in dry dock, they actually cut the boat in two, separated it 30 feet, and built in the sides, and launched a longer boat. And this was done on the Mary Powell as well, and actually is a very common practice. Inexpensive way to get more capacity. When you look at the Albany, one of the first things that catches your eye when you go inside, especially if it's dinner time, is the dining room. Now, when you look at this image, you may think you're looking at a restaurant, a high-class restaurant in New York City. And that's exactly the feeling that the steamboat company wanted you to feel, because you're going to be dining in luxury, you're going to be traveling in luxury. So if you look at the crystal decanters, the crystal goblets, the vases, this was, again, the height of luxury. And if you look at our next boat, the Hendrick Hudson, which most people think is the most beautiful boat that was ever built for the Hudson, you get more luxury when you see the grand staircase. And again, you might say, well, this must be a New York City hotel. Must be. But no, this is a steamboat with all the carved wood and mahogany. And that dome on top is Tiffany glass. Spared no expense. This is the other side of that same observation room, where you would find fresh flowers, vases full of flowers. You would find murals on the wall. And most of these palatial steamboats had artwork, because they were developing this cultural experience. This was high-class travel. So a lot of the paintings were actually the Hudson River School paintings. This is the famous Mary Powell, and this was one of our boats, and in fact, this was about the fastest boat on the Hudson. Doesn't have a lot of room for passengers. The Robert Fulton that we're on today can carry 4,000. This would carry a lot less, but less weight, faster boat. And she lasted up until 1920. It was a very long time, especially for a steamboat of this vintage. But when you got on the Mary Powell, you would get a dinner menu that you would get on these other palatial things that was, boats, that would look like this. You were getting a full fare. You could get porterhouse steaks, tenderloin steaks. You got pastries, vegetables, desserts. Again, what you would find in a high-class New York City restaurant. And the wine list, well, it's more than red and white wine. You could have champagnes, clarets, sherry, Rhine wines. They really catered to the upper class on these wonderful steamboats. I mentioned culture with the paintings and the murals. Another part of the culture was the concert band. Every boat had a concert band, and in case of our day line, we had a 22-page pamphlet that we would give to our passengers, which would list all the songs that were going to, not songs, the tunes that were going to be played, such as marches, classical music, and waltzes. No dancing. If you look at the Mary Powell in this particular picture, you might be wondering, how did these huge boats, up to 400 feet, a little bit more, how did they get powered? If you look here at the center of the boat, you see this diamond shape, and you see this shaft here. This is what was called the walking beam engine, and all the riverboats on the Hudson used this engine. Here's a model of the engine, and on the left side here, you see a cylinder. Now that cylinder could be as much as 7 feet in diameter. It was huge. And that cylinder inside had a piston. Steam would come into the bottom of the cylinder, push the piston up as much as 12 to 14 feet. It's quite a stroke. That would push this down, turning the crank shaft, which would turn the paddle wheel. So it was this kind of a motion all throughout the tour. Now later on, when you see the film of our boat in New York, you will see this operating in the background, so keep a sharp lookout. Let's talk about the route that our day line would take. We would start in New York City, of course, and we would go up to Hudson. There were a lot of different stops for the day line. and that would include West Point, Newburgh, Kingston, Hudson. What the Day Line did was very shrewd. To increase business, they gave people a reason to get on these steamboats and have enjoyable sessions. They built what they called pleasure parks. This is the pleasure park the Hudson River Day Line, our company, built at Indian Point across from West Point. You can see this huge pool, and this was enjoyed by New York City residents primarily, coming up to cool off from the hot summers. What you might remember or not remember is at the turn of the century, New York City environment was pretty bad. The air was polluted, there was a lot of garbage, there was a lot of noise, a lot of crowding. So Day Line capitalized on this and said, escape all this, come to our steamboat, enjoy the ride, enjoy the scenery, and stop off at one of our pleasure parks, and we'll pick you up on the way back and bring you home. And this worked out for many years during the golden era of steamboat. If you didn't want to go, or after you did go onto the pool, you could go to the Indian Point grounds, picnic grounds, where you could have baseball games or just relax and just sun. A little farther north, if you got to Newburgh, you could take a trolley to the Orange Lake area, which had a huge pleasure park. And here you can see that there was a roller skating rink and a Japanese tea garden. I forgot to mention that throughout the golden age, especially the early parts before the turn of the century, dress on a steamboat was very, very formal. This was high-class dinners, high-class comfort, high-class dress. So men were in hats and suits, and the women wore their long dresses and those wonderful big hats that they had at that time. It was really very interesting. Also at Orange Lake, you could go to the dancing pavilion, or you could walk the midway where there were amusements and food. The big attraction was the Ferris wheel, and there were Ferris wheels at different pleasure parks. I'm going to handle questions later, okay? At pleasure parks, and this was one of the biggest ones around, and was very, very popular. If you did not get off at Kingston, you went a bit farther north and got off at Poughkeepsie, you could go to the Woodcliff Pleasure Park, which was on the site where Marist College is today. Now this was a large park. It had a roller coaster, had a Ferris wheel, a merry-go-round, and there were different games such as the whip. The whip was the forerunner of our action rides that were in later in the century. And over here, of course, is the roller coaster, and back here is the Hudson River. It was right on the Hudson, as Marist is today. If you did get off at Poughkeepsie, you had another choice. You could take transportation and go to Upton Lake in Clinton Corners and enjoy boating, and again see the famous hats and the formal dress. And this was really a sought-after thing to do. Boating was a big thing back then. If you didn't get off at Poughkeepsie and instead you went up to, got off at Kingston, you could get off at the Kingston Point Park. You had a couple choices. One is you could take the train shown here up to the city of Kingston, or what most people did, they got off and they walked to the pleasure park of Kingston Point Park, which was built by our company specifically for the steamboat trade, again, to attract people. And you can see the gorgeous landscaping, there were walking paths, there were amusement rides, and there was a Ferris wheel here as well. If you didn't get off at Kingston, maybe you want to get off at Catskill, because Catskill offered a very different diversion. You would come to the dock, a train would take you inland to the base of the mountain, and then you would take a cable car up the mountain, and there were these huge hotels up there, such as the Catskill Mountain House, or as shown here, the Hotel Catskill. This is 1881 when it was built, and just as a great example of the magnificent structures that were built, again, for the trade that could afford it. And they had these million-dollar views, of course, of the Hudson Valley. So these were a big draw for the Hudson River steamboat trade. 1927, it's an interesting year. Our company had 7 boats operating at the time, including our Robert Fulton here with a 4,000 capacity. The reason this is interesting because even with all these boats, we're now going to get into the decline of the golden era of steamboats. In fact, it really came to an end about the end of the 1920s. And it was not because of the railroad competition. In the late 20s and early 30s, automobiles were being enclosed and were very comfortable. So it was much more advantageous for families to go to these pleasure parks and other points of interest in the family car. And that's really what killed off the traffic in the steamboats. However, they maintained scheduled service until 1948 when we had to declare bankruptcy. But our president did see an opportunity in running excursions, such as the one we're on today. We're going from New York City to Poughkeepsie and return. One of the bigger boats and famous boats was the Alexander Hamilton. And that was actually the last steamboat on the Hudson to run excursions. It ended in 1971. Thus came to an end 165 years of side-wheeler steamboats on the Hudson. You might be interested, oh, here's the Alexander Hamilton. A lot of people still remember this famous boat. You might be interested in what the biggest boat ever built for the Hudson River was. It was this night boat called the Berkshire. It was 440 feet long. It was known as the Queen of the Night Boats. It could hold 2,500 passengers and over 400 staterooms. And in 1907 dollars, it cost $2.5 million. Imagine what that would be today. So it was an expensive boat. It lasted for a lot of years. And it was, as I said, the largest inland boat ever built at 440 feet. This is a good example of one of the staterooms that you would have found on the Berkshire. Again, traveling in comfort, and what you would also be able to get is a stateroom with a private bath, which was pretty neat, but not everybody did that. What's coming up next are two movies that we're going to show you. One is the views of the Hudson Valley, some of which you'll see alongside your trip today. And then we have a film that was done a couple of months ago on this very boat, the Robert Fulton. And you'll see people on the deck. You may recognize some of them as your neighbors, so keep a sharp eye. And look for the walking beam engine as well. Before I go up to the pilot house, I'd like to give a couple of thanks. The first is to Glenn Morris for his generous loan of these historic photographs of the Hudson River steamboats. And I'd like to thank Kathy for her help in the presentation. At the end of the film, which will be the end of your excursion, I've asked the galley to provide some special treats, and they are over there on the table for your enjoyment. And the Historical Society tells me that they have on sale on the book, on the shelf in the back, on the table in the back, their latest publication called Building Clinton. It's a very thick book, covers over 350 historic sites in the town of Clinton, available at $27 for members, $38 non-members. They're also offering what they call the Green Book. It's a very thick book of the history of the town of Clinton for $20. And their latest offering are 1867 maps, color maps, also on the back table for $20. They've also left some membership forms for those of you who are interested. Do start at $15 individual. And there's copies of their newsletter, quarterly newsletter, that are free. This might be a good time to take questions. Any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, the Orange Lake, what year was that approximately, the Orange Lake postcards?
Postcards?
The postcards you were showing are pictures of the Orange Lake.
Yeah. The gold postcards was around 1907 to about 1918, the World War I. And everybody bought and sent postcards. And this was so popular that they were made a lot of them were made in Germany and came over to this. And steamboats were one of the most popular of the postcards.
So the of Orange County Park, what year would that have been that the park
I would
was
guess
there?
the 1920s, looking at the dancers. And I think somewhere even earlier that, looking at the Japanese tea garden people with the long dresses. Yes? Pardon me? Repeat the question. Okay, we were talking about postcards. Yes.
that there's a high-end trade. Wasn't there also kind of a low-end trade that took up immigrants and people from the Lower
Yes.
East Side, New York, that people couldn't afford it?
Yeah,
You could comment on that, because I know there was a famous incident with one of those.
Especially the turn of the century. Prices came down, and the service was not as luxurious as it was before the turn of the century. A trip to, in about 1915, a trip on the day line from New York City to Albany would be about $3 or $6 round trip. It was half that to get to Poughkeepsie. I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. Yes?
How long did it take to get from New York City to Albany on the boat?
How often?
How long did it take to get?
The Claremont, this is no stops now, okay? The Claremont took something like 11 hours. By the time we got to the 1910 or so, it was down to about 4 hours nonstop.
4 hours from Manhattan.
Yes, nonstop. Yes.
How many months out of the year did they operate, considering winter conditions?
And the question is, how many months of the year did they operate, especially considering winter? They did not always run during the winter because they couldn't plow through the ice, of course. So typically the trade dropped off around the winter. And I don't have the exact months that we operated. I don't remember from my days at the day line.
Probably vary.
I would expect it would vary with the weather. Yes.
The Indian Point pool that you showed, that, now was that the pool by Bear Mountain, or was it more by where the nuclear power plant is in Indian Point?
Is Indian Point, where was that pool, all right? Bear Mountain did have its own pool. In fact, that was a major attraction for Bear Mountain. But the pool I showed you was at Indian Point, and that was all torn down, and the power plant, nuclear power plant, is there now today. They tell me. Yes.
The 4 hours time non-stop is quite astounding considering the train now takes well over 3 hours.
What was the question?
But it's a fast boat.
What was the time with stops?
You said it was 4 hours to Albany
Non-stop.
non-stop.
Yeah.
I said that's pretty amazing because the train now takes over 3 hours to Albany.
But it makes stops, doesn't it?
Not that many, no. That's a very fast boat indeed.
Okay. Well, it's my experience. Yes.
I just wanted to say that this Sunday in Kingston is postcard show. And if anyone has an interest, you can go to the postcard show in Kingston on Sunday. And it's wonderful because they have some of these postcards that cover all this stuff. And it's really a wonderful thing. If you've never been to it, check it out. It's in Kingston on Sunday.
What is the question?
Yes.
What do they do once they reach the boats? What do they sink them? Did they disassemble them? Did they blow them up?
That's a very interesting question. I don't have hours to tell you. But the boat right now, the Robert Fulton, that was actually towed down to the Grand Cayman Islands. It was beached. They brought in earth around it, and it became a little shopping center where you could drive up to it, which I thought was pretty interesting. Other boats, some suffered disasters. In our company, we had the Washington Irving, and that unfortunately caught fire and sunk while it was at dock. Was not on a trip. A number of the steamboats were actually acquired by the government during World War II. They were either used as barracks for the troops or for carrying freight where they needed to go. So that was another example. Some, and I have to tell you this, that steamboating was not always the safest, and there were some major disasters, especially in the early years. So one fate of a steamboat would be explosion. And that did happen with a fire for the General Slocum in 1904. And there were about 1,100 people who lost their lives down in New York Harbor. So it was not always a happy experience. But the day line, we were good. Yes?
Any cars on the boat?
Pardon me?
Did they carry any cars on the boat?
Were there cars on the boat?
What,
Automobiles.
did they carry them?
Yes.
The night boats carried automobiles, as you saw, up to 200 on the Berkshire. And that was, again, to take care of the trade. That's what people wanted. They wanted to bring their car with them when they go off in Albany and take trips. So yes, they made provisions for, but the Day Line never carried freight or cars, just people. Anything else? Yes?
Take to get up to speed, what's the maximum speed?
The maximum speed.
Fast? I don't know. I don't know. Okay. I'm going to go up to the pilot house, and I hope you enjoy your cruise. We will begin the two movies. And on behalf of the Hudson River Day Line, we thank you for your patronage, and hope you enjoy your cruise. Thank you very much.